Hey everyone, Skeletor here. I'm going to go ahead and do an updated video on analyzing Retribution logs. Last video was during Old Year. It's not out of date, but there is some new things that we can go over and look up. So I figured a new video would be the best way to do that. Before we get into that though, I'm going to go on a little bit of a short rant here about a few various things regarding logs. So one thing I mentioned in the last video, and I'm going to mention it here again, is that when you're looking at your logs and you're looking at your parse, like your percentage, your percentile, whether it be overall or item level, that doesn't necessarily indicate how well you did or did not do. That's just ranking you compared to everyone else in terms of DPS. You can do high DPS and not play optimally, or you can play perfect and possibly do low DPS due to various factors. So when you're trying to get an idea of how you are doing, you can't rely on those numbers to tell you. If you want to know how well you did, you have to look at your logs in detail, like we're going to do here, and figure out what you did right, what you did wrong, and what you can do to improve the things you got wrong. It really is kind of a trap. What you see in Discord is people, they don't talk about their overall parse. They always talk about their item level parse. Like, well, my item level parse is X percentage, which again, I'm gonna call that a trap for new players. It doesn't really mean anything. It's just a measure of how much DPS you did compared to somebody else. So again, the best way to know how you did is to go over your logs. Another thing that you'll see is people will ask for help with logs. And what I'll see is they'll link some logs, usually normal or heroic, which isn't a big deal. If you're only a normal or heroic, that's fine. Everyone at every level can use help. But sometimes these players, they'll link their normal or heroic logs, and they have mythic kills. And at a quick glance, it might look like the heroic logs are okay. And you look at their mythic logs and they don't seem very good in comparison. So what usually happens is that we tell them that, why would you want us to go over this log when you're in this content instead? Harder content. Because generally you aim to improve in harder content. And sometimes people will say that they think heroic is better representation of how they play than mythic, which I'd have to say is not true. Mythic is inherently harder than heroic. There's more mechanics and whatnot that you have to deal with. So if your performance doesn't carry over from heroic to mythic, that's on you as a player and not on the class itself. And that's the main takeaway there, is that, again, mythic is more important than heroic in terms of numbers. In heroic, you can pretty much do anything. One of the things you can do is you can compare the number of heroic kills and the number of mythic kills. Now, this log here, it's Champions of the Light. It's technically a mythic boss, but it's very easy. It is very accessible to do. It's not hard at all. And by comparison, there's 28,000 kills on heroic champions, and on mythic champions, there's only 9,000 kills. And the way that works out, if you wanted to get an orange parse on heroic, you'd only have to be in the top 1,400 kills in terms of DPS to do that. Where if you compare it to mythic, where there's not as many people in there, to get that 95% orange log, you would actually have to be in the top 450. So the barrier to entry is to getting a higher parse is also, there's a big gap there between heroic and mythic. Alright, so another thing that people do, they'll come in, they'll ask how someone's doing so much DPS. What they'll do is they'll go to a log. Let's say a common example was back in the start of 8.1. when it was still only Uldir, people would commonly look at parses for Talic, and they would see this. Here are the Talic parses from 8.1. And they'll be like, how did this person do 30.9 thousand DPS on Talic? And the second person's only 22k. And they don't understand the context of top logs. Looking at top logs in general, you might not learn as much as you would expect, and honestly, things you find might not be good for you. It's not a good idea to look at a top log and just copy it blindly. If we go into this log, we can see what happened. So we'll go in, we'll translate, and right away we can see that this Ret is well above his other teammates in terms of damage. And if we look at his damage breakdown, we can see that most of his damage is actually in the ads in this fight. And if we look at his teammates, down the list here, for the most part, none of them touch the ads. They let this one player do all the damage to the ads himself, which led to him having a high parse. So again, can't just go in and follow things blindly. Another common thing people look at, they would look at, say, Mythic Cahoon. On Mythic Cahoon, a lot of the top parses use Execution Sentence, which wasn't really for progress. That was purely for cheesing. They would use it during every beam in their crusade and do a lot of damage, because that beam did cause Cahoon to take double damage. So the important thing you can do is just look at your own character. You don't have to worry about other parses. You shouldn't look at someone's log and compare your log to it. You should just look on your log as itself. And right now, the common thing is champions again on heroic or normal. People will look at those logs. And right now, that fight is already cheesed on heroic. It's pretty much already cheesed in Mythic too, where they just tank the boss and the abs together, and they nuke it down very fast because their guild is very good, and they have very good gear. And if you're not in a guild that's very good and has very fast clear times, and you don't use the same burn strategies, you're not going to do as well. So again, the best thing you can do is focus on yourself. And the last little bit, I know this rant's almost over, I apologize, but the last bit, people will come to Discord, they'll ask if their stats are good or if their stats look okay, they'll link their stat weights, they'll ask if their gear is good, they'll ask what someone should be simming, they'll ask what a good sim is, they'll ask what other people sim, and usually what it comes down to is that they're wondering how to do more DPS themselves. They find that they're not doing enough DPS. And again, for improving in the game, there's no easy way out. The best thing you can do is learn to look at your own logs, which is what we're going to do here. So again, it's all about personal responsibility. What can you do to improve yourself? But anyways, we'll get onto our log here. This is just a random log of champions Mythic. I'm not picking anyone in particular. I went to the rankings, and I picked a person, and we got a log. And the log has a few things that I want to go over. Alright, so the first thing that we do, we go over their setup. And the setup includes their gear, their talents, their Azerite, and simming. So we see here, guy is 403. Pretty good item level. He's got 400 Azerite pieces. So they have the 5th ring, that's very good. His neck is 399. So it's high enough to use those first 3 rings. So he has all of his DPS traits. For Trinkets, he's got a gore-crusted Butcher's Block, that's pretty good. He's got a vial of animated blood, which isn't the best, but it's okay. And it looks pretty standard. For talents here, Righteous Verdict, Hammer of Wrath, Wake of Ashes, Crusade. Those are all pretty straightforward. Then looking at his Azerite, Avenger's Might, that's pretty good. Variant Power, also good. Indomitable Justice, this one's odd. Light's Decree, that's good. And Treacherous Covenant is also good. So what we're going to do here, we're going to sim his character, and we're going to see if these choices are correct. So, you would load your character, you would go to Top Gear and Raid Bots, and you would paste in your information there. So by default, it will do this. One thing I want to point out, there is an extra trinket here. In this fight, he was using a Vial and a Gore Crusted, but looking at his character, he actually replaced his Gore Crusted with a new trinket, the Rage. But we're going to see if that was actually an upgrade for him or not. So we'll choose that. We'll look at the Azerite available. So Indomitable Justice, that one's odd. So we're going to choose Avenger's Might to sim that. That's fine. Look here, we'll also just choose Avenger's Might just to test. And on here, we'll choose Light's Decree and Avenger's Might. And that also looks okay. Also on these shoulders here, we have Azerite Globules, but there's also Life Speed. We can sim that as well to see if that's any good. And that's pretty much it. If you want to adjust any of these other settings here, you can. We're going to leave it default here though. And we'll find Top Gear. That'll take a moment. Not too long, but just a moment. Almost done. Obviously, if you don't have premium, you'll have to wait in queue first. But premium is definitely worth it, and if not, just wait. Waiting isn't going to kill you. And there's our sim here. And right away, we can see there's a couple changes here that we would make. First, on the helmet, Avenger's Might was an upgrade over Indomitable Justice. On the shoulders here, it was also changed. We're using Life Speed there now. And for trinkets, it turns out that his Rage trinket was actually a downgrade. He should still be using his Butcher's Block. And that's mainly because his Vial is a use trinket, and the Rage is also a use trinket. Generally, unless you know what you are doing, you do not want to use two on-use trinkets. And if we compare that to what he has, this is what he has now, 21.128. And this set is 21.687. So that's just free DPS there. Well, not free, because Azerite does cost money to respec. Not much though if you don't change often. So that's just a little bit of DPS you can gain there for pretty much nothing. Other than that though, the talents look fine. These talents were best for a setup. A note about talents that Crusade is not always the best talent. And Righteous Verdict is not always the best talent depending on the fight. Now for Crusade, that's pretty straightforward. You can sim Crusade, you can sim Inquisition, and you can sim Divine Purpose. You can compare them. If you wanted to do that, you can go back to your Top Gear setup. And you can just choose the other talents there if you wanted to. And again, like earlier I mentioned, don't just look at top logs and copy them blindly. You want to figure it out for yourself. And the way to figure this out is to sim it for this row. For the first row, when it comes to Zeal, if you sim Zeal versus Righteous Verdict on a single target fight, Righteous Verdict will always win. But there are some fights where there is enough AoE where you might want to consider switching to Zeal, and we'll talk more about that later. Alright, back to the log though. The first thing that we usually do in a log is we also open up WoW Analyzer, which I have here. I've already put the log into the analyzer here. It has its own checklist that it has, but we'll just go over in our own order here. One of the things I do check though first is be well prepared. So he's enchanted, he has gems, he's got food, flask, it was high quality food. He used a second potion. He got marked for the pre-potion here, but sometimes WoW Analyzer is wrong. And in this case, he did have a potion pre-combat, so he's actually okay there as well. And if you want to check that easily, you can go back to the log itself, go to buffs, and we can see here, we see his potion first time, second time. So he did use both potions, so that was fine. We'll go back to WoW Analyzer, we'll scroll down. The first thing we'll do is look at the opener. So here's his opener. One thing you don't see is the icon for Shield of Vengeance. He actually used this pre-combat. So before the fight even started, he popped Shield of Vengeance. And looking at his other logs, he does this very often. This is on purpose. This wasn't an accident. He then used his potion. He used Wake of Ashes, and then went into Crusade. And even after going in Crusade, he hit Hammer of Wrath to build, and then he hit Blade to build, even though he was already at 5 HP. So that was 3 wasted off the start, and then he did a couple Divine Storms back to back. So right away here, the opener is not ideal. What he would have wanted to do in this case is he would have opened with Blade, and then Judge, and then Crusader Strike, or not Crusader Strike, Crusade. Blade, Judge, and Crusade. Once you pop Crusade, you would also want to use your Trinket, which we'll mention in a second. You would use a Templar's Verdict, and then you would use Wake, and you would go from there. And I do have my own guide, which you probably already know, which will go here. If you go to the guide, you can use a drop down, go to Rec Guide, Priority, Openers. It'll bring you here, and it has different openers listed for different talent builds. So in this case, this was Righteous Verdict, Hammer of Wrath, Wake, and Crusade, which isn't on this list directly, but there is a close substitute, which is this one here, Execution Sentence. You would follow this same opener, Blade, Judgment, Crusade, Templar's Verdict, Wake, Templar's Verdict, Hammer of Wrath, and then instead of Execution Sentence, you would just use Templar's Verdict again, and you would have your 10 stacks. We'll go back to the log though. One thing that you don't see here, you don't see his Trinket. There is an issue with logs currently. Sometimes the Trinket is not recorded properly, but again, we can go back to Warcraft logs itself. We can see here that he used his Trinket. He used it at the very start of the fight. Now again, with on-use trinkets, that's something that's also important, and I also cover that in my guide. With a trinket like this, you would have want to saved it until you had your 10 stacks of Crusade. You wouldn't want to pop it right away. So on my guide, again under Priority, there's the cooldown section. Talk about Avenging Wrath, about Crusade in general, Shield of Vengeance, and trinkets here. So it says how you should use trinkets. So on-use trinkets are still off the GCD, and trinkets that provide stats should not be directly macroed with Avenging Wrath. They should be delayed and used on your first damaging ability. Or when using Crusade, they should either be used at 10 stacks of Crusade, or when the buff duration of the trinket matches the remaining duration of Crusade. Which means if your trinket lasts 12 seconds, you can either use that trinket once you have 10 stacks, or you can use that trinket when you have 12 seconds left on Crusade. Either is fine. It also covers cooldowns. One thing that we can see here from the log, go to the log itself, is that he used his trinket 3 times. So the first one was in Crusade, but it wasn't optimal. The second one was not in Crusade, and the third one was not in Crusade. And this is because the trinket itself has a shorter cooldown than in Crusade, which we can see here. It's 1.5 minutes. And what you want to do is trinkets that do last, or that have a cooldown of 2 minutes or less, but more than 1 minute, you still want to use them exclusively in Crusade or Avenging Wrath, if they provide stats, which Vial does. It provides strength, or like the Spyglass here, or Doom's Fury. They all fall in the category of using them exclusively with Crusade. The only exception to that would be if the fight's coming to an end and you're not going to have Crusade back, but your trinket is back off cooldown. You can use that trinket at the last part of the fight by itself if you're not going to get that last Crusade. But that's just min-maxing with that last bit. You definitely want to make sure, though, that it's used in your Crusade and used at 10 stacks or when the duration will match. We'll also look at his second Crusade here. When you go into Crusade, you want to have at least 3 Holy Power already. Ideally, you will have 5. In this case, he went into Crusade, and he used 2 builders right away. So your first global in Crusade should always be a spender. And we didn't have a spender until the 3rd global. So again, there's another easy point to improve there. Just remember to go into Crusade. Well, you have Holy Power already, and that's also mentioned in my guide in the Crusade section. There was one thing I forgot to mention in the opener here. You see here that he used Divine Storm twice in a row. And you might be wondering, well, maybe it was Imperium Power. What we can do is we can actually go back to Warcraft logs. On Imperium Power here, we'll press the little plus button to give it its own little graph. We'll go back to damage done. You can do damage on Arcast. We'll do damage done. We'll just switch it to Divine Storm. And we'll go to events. So he has Divine Storm, and he used it on this first he gained Imperium Power, sorry, and used it for a Divine Storm. But then he used a second Divine Storm on a single target without Imperium Power. So this was a mistake. In this case, this should have been a Templar's Verdict instead. If you only have one target, you should be using Templar's Verdict. And we'll talk more about that later in detail as well. So, 2 main takeaways from there is opener. Make sure your opener is proper. And make sure your Crusades later in the fight, that you're using them properly as well, that you're going in with Holy Power already. And making sure that your trinket usage is proper. Those are all things you can double check on my guide to make sure you are doing it right. Second thing that we go over is Holy Power wasted. So here there was 13. So again, his opener is where he wasted some of it, because he went Wake. Then he went Hammer and Blade. Or we can go to Holy Power usage here. So there was 4 total wasted from Blade, 5 total from Wake, 2 total from Judgment, and 2 total from Hammer of Wrath. So for Blade of Justice, Crusader Strike, Judgment, and Hammer of Wrath, you should never waste Holy Power. You always want to make sure that you're not going to overcap when using one of those 4 moves. The only move that can potentially have waste sometimes is Wake of Ashes, but even then, it's a bit specific. And if we want to break this down further, we'll go back to the log itself. We can close this graph for now. We'll go to Resources. We'll change hit points to holy power. And we can see here, he used hammer, he wasted 1. He used blade, he wasted 2. Scroll down, here's 1 waste from judgment. Here's a 2 wasted from blade, so he gained 0 from that. Here's where he wasted 2 from wake. You never want to waste 2 from wake. 1 from judgment. Here's one where he wasted 3 from wake. So 2 is bad, 3 is really bad. And also another one there from hammer. So we'll just reference that with my guide. We'll scroll back up here. So Wake of Ashes. Wake of Ashes should be used at 0 holy power, or at 1 holy power if Blade of Justice is on cooldown, for 1 global cooldown or longer. So again, you either want to waste none, or only 1 if Blade is on cooldown. So if you're at 2 holy power, and your other generators are on cooldown, you want to wait for them to come back off of cooldown first. You don't want to hit wake. And speaking of Wake of Ashes, it's one of the only moves that we use that doesn't have a target, so there is a possibility that we don't do damage while using it. And the best way to check that is to go back to here. We'll go to damage done. We'll go to tables really quick. This plus sign next to wake, we'll go ahead and press. And notice here that he had 5 casts of Wake of Ashes. But if we look here, it only did damage 4 times. We know that he used Wake at the very start of the fight, so we would expect damage there, but there is none. So he actually used his first Awake when he was not in range of the boss. So he gained the holy power still, but it did not do any damage. You always want to make sure when you are using Wake that you are hitting your targets. You don't want to waste that. Another thing I want to point out, we're going to use a separate log for this, is some people still use Inquisition, so I want to show an example of what not to do with Inquisition. So we'll go to this separate log here. It's also a champions log, doesn't really matter though. What we can see here is that 92.9% of his damage was buffed. When you're using Inquisition, you want to strive for that 99%. If you're not getting that 99% buffed damage, it's usually not worth taking this talent. And if we scroll down, we'll look at the opener. We can actually see that he used his first Inquisition inside of his wings, which you never want to do. And even here, it tells you on WoW Analyzer, there's an alert. You refreshed Inquisition during Avenging Wrath. It is better to refresh early before Avenging Wrath, so you can spend Holy Power on damage during it. Again, for openers, my guide, it has an opener for this. We'll go back to it. Scroll down. So for Zeal, our Righteous Verdict, Hammer, Wrath, Awake, Inquisition, Blade, Judgment, Inquisition, and then Wings, and then Wake. Then Templar's Verdict, and continue on from there. That's how you would want to open. And if we go through, there was a short drop there, but also during that drop, his Wake was not used inside that window, so Wake was not buffed. That's not good. Alright, here's a case where his Inquisition, it actually fell off during his wings. So he had to refresh during wings, and again he lost a global during wings because of that. So you always want to make sure your wings is your Inquisition is already refreshed before going into wings. You see there's a bit of a larger gap here, but another case where Wake was not in that window, so it lost damage there. And just some more small gaps there. So he used a Spender, and then Wake, and then he used Inquisition. So again, that's just lost damage. And in cases like this over here, where you're going into wings, I have that covered in my guide, which is right here under further considerations. You want to ensure that Inquisition has more time remaining than the length of Avenging Wrath or Crusade, which Avenging Wrath is 20 seconds. If you have Light's Decree, then that's 25. In Crusade, not Crusade, you can't do it with Crusade, but just Avenging Wrath, so it's either 20 or 25 seconds. So if your Inquisition is at or below 20 seconds remaining, and the cooldown of Avenging Wrath is less than 15 seconds, you want to refresh your Inquisition early with 3 Holy Power to avoid having it run out during Avenging Wrath. So again, that's just to make sure you're doing the most damage possible during your wings. Alright, back to the main log here though. We want to look at the overall rotation and how it was going. So we mentioned that one thing there, that Divine Storm that was on a single target, not good. We scroll through here. And we're just looking at it in general. We'll go over some specific details here in a moment. You can see a case like this here. He prioritized a Crusader Strike over Hammer of Wrath. Hammer of Wrath does have a higher priority than Crusader Strike. And we have some cases like this here where he's using Judgment before Blade, and it happens a few times. If you're not going to overcap your Holy Power, Blade has a higher priority than Judgment, because the default cooldown of Judgment is 12 seconds. The default cooldown of Blade is 10.5. So what that means in terms of global cooldowns, it's 7 global cooldowns for Judgment and 6 global cooldowns for Blade. So if you use Judgment first, that's 1 global cooldown, and now there's 6 remaining. So if you press Blade second, that means Judgment and Blade will come off cooldown at the same time, and that'll create a cooldown clash. And we try to avoid those as much as we can. If you go through, there's more of that where it's getting prioritized over. Another common thing that you can see from the log is that he's spending right away in most cases. So rather than continue building Holy Power, he's choosing to hit Templar's Verdict as soon as he can. In some cases, that is advisable. In some cases, it's not. Generally speaking, you want to aim to have your generators on cooldown before you spend. And for Crusader Strike, because it has 2 charges, you only need 1 charge on cooldown because they do not recharge independently. It only recharges 1 charge at a time. So as long as 1 is on cooldown, that's all you need. Again, on my guide, it has a priority system there of how you should prioritize what you're doing. If you're not quite getting the grasp of it, there's an add-on called Hikili, which you can download. I'll put a link in the description as well. That will help you with your rotation. Now, as a note, it will not show you your opener. You have to learn the opener yourself. So once you learn your opener and you do that, you can follow the add-on after that point. But you still want to know why you're pressing certain buttons, so you still want to read this. You don't just want to blindly follow something. Alright, and that was pretty much it for the rotation there. You're looking for, are the abilities being used in the right order? For Holy Power, is it being spent right away? Or are you ensuring that your other abilities are on your generators are on cooldown first? And a couple other things in the rotation is a big thing is downtime. That's how long it's taking you to use your abilities. You can see in some cases there's a bit of a delay between when an ability is used. Now, one delay isn't a big deal, but over the course of an entire fight, those small delays add up. You can see that there's some larger delays here as well. Now on champions, on some guilds, you have to switch to kill the ads. If you take too long to switch to the ads, you'll lose time there, so you should always aim to use your divine steed to get to the ads. It won't take you this long to get to the ads. You can get there in a couple seconds. And after the ad dies, you want to go back on the boss. But you can see here the ads are probably dead, and he's waiting to switch back to the boss. Some guilds will tell you to not attack the boss until the Zeal switches, which if that's what your guild is doing, that's okay. Realistically, you could probably just continue to attack the boss. As long as your tanks are prepared for it, or your healers, they should be able to survive the damage they take. But if your raid leader tells you to wait, then you should wait. But we did lose some time from that, quite a bit of time until the Zeal switched over. And that happened again later as well. Here's just a gap of downtime in general. Here's another gap here, but you can see that he used his Divine Steed, so he was probably going to the ads. You can see here the ads are dead, so he's going to switch back to the boss. But when he switches back to the boss, again, he's waiting, either because he doesn't know better, or because his raid leader told him not to. Either way, you do what's appropriate for you. If you can attack the boss, go ahead and attack the boss. If you're told to wait, just wait. It sucks, but if you gotta do what you gotta do. And there was one thing that I forgot to mention for cooldown usage. Cooldown usage also includes potions. So first potion, he used it as a pre-pot, which was fine. That's correct. But a second potion here, you can see it was used outside of Crusade. So he used Crusade here. Crusade ended here. And then he used his potion afterwards, a bit later. You always want to make sure your potion is used during your wings. The only time that you wouldn't use your potion inside your wings is if you're on a very short fight that's less than 2 minutes. So you want to have wings back, so you'll want to use your second potion early. Or if there's a part of a fight where you're instructed to hold your potion, which for example was a common thing on Fetid Devourer from Uldir, you might have been told to save your potion for one of the ads. So if it's not one of those two scenarios, you want to make sure that your potion is used during your wings. It's most beneficial to be used there. Another thing that we can check is the number of judgment debuffs being consumed. So there's a nice little stat here. So there was a total of 18 judgments. 11 were consumed by Templar's Verdict. 5 were consumed by Divine Storm. So there was 2 that was not consumed. Now generally, you want to aim to have all your judgments be consumed. There are a couple cases where it's okay. If there's a really high priority ad that has to die, that's almost dead, and there's the chance that hitting judgment will kill it or it will die before you use a spender, that's okay, as long as the target is a very high priority. The second scenario is that the boss is almost dead, and the last move you use is judgment. So you hit judgment and the boss dies, so you couldn't consume that judgment, and that's okay. So we'll start at the end there. We can see that judgment was not his last move. He was able to use a spender, so he didn't miss one from that. So realistically what happened in this fight is he either used judgment on the boss and then ran to the ads and didn't consume it, or he used judgment on one of the ads when it was almost dead and the ad died before he used it. And for Mythic Champions of the Light, those ads they're not high priority. You're not going to wipe if they don't die as fast as possible. So you want to make sure to delay that or target a different ad. Alright. So one thing we also want to go over is just Divine Storm usage in general. So there are a few rules for Divine Storm. Again, on a single target, you don't want to use Divine Storm if it's not free from Empyrean Power. So if you have an Empyrean Power proc, it's okay to use it on one target. If you don't have a proc, you could use it on 2 targets if you're using Zeal, or 3 targets if you are using a Righteous Verdict. So in this case, we know he was using Righteous Verdict from his character. Now, it's a bit of a pain to look at this, but it is possible. So we'll go to Warcraft logs. We'll remove this little chart. And what we'll do is we'll go to buffs first. We'll find Empyrean Power. And we'll add Empyrean Power buffs to this. Same as we did earlier when we found out that he used one of his Divine Storms in the opener without Empyrean Power. And it's the same thing. Then we'll go down to damage done. We can filter that directly to Divine Storm. And what we can do is switch from tables to events. Now this is a bit picky if you want to do this. You don't have to do this. But if you're curious and you want to see if you're consuming your Divine Storms, or sorry, if you're consuming your Judgments with Divine Storm, as we've seen earlier, 5 of his Divine Storms were consumed. Or sorry, 5 of his Judgments were consumed by Divine Storm. Which can be okay, and it cannot be okay. So if you're on single target, ideally you will not consume Judgment with an Empyrean Power proc. If it's 2 or more targets, that's okay. So if you're on a single target and you have an Empyrean Power proc, if you can use Templar's Verdict or a generator, then Templar's Verdict, before you consume the debuff, you should do that. So back to the log as an example. One we can look at here is at 33 seconds. I'm sorry, at 33, where he gained his Empyrean Power. This is one where he did consume a Judgment. And to filter it down further, there's a little target auras filter here. And we can change this to Judgment. The green box means when the target had a Judgment debuff. You click one more time, you get a red box. That means no Judgment. And click again to reset. We want to switch to the green. So at 33 seconds was when he did use a Divine Storm on a single target, and it consumed the Judgment debuff. And if you want to check that, you can go to the timeline back on here. We'll go back to 33 seconds. And we can see here, this is the Divine Storm that consumed the Judgment debuff. And based on his last 2 moves here, he has at least 3 Holy Power, so he should have used a Templar's Verdict first, and then he should have used his Divine Storm. It's more damage if your Templar's Verdict consumes the Judgment debuff on a single target. The only time that you'll want to consume on a single target with Empyrean Power is if all your abilities are on cooldown. If everything's on cooldown and you can't use Templar's Verdict, but you have an Empyrean Power proc and your Judgment debuff is up, that's okay then, but that should be pretty rare. And if you want to do that, you can do that for each item in the list. That takes some time though. You don't have to, it's just something to be aware of. Once you know that you shouldn't be doing that, you don't have to check for it, you just have to know instinctively to, okay, there's one target there, I have a proc, Judgment debuff is on, I should avoid using that Empyrean Power proc with the Judgment debuff, if possible, on one target. But if you want to check for it, that's how you do it. It takes a bit of time though, like I said. Now, the other things that you check, we'll turn this off, is you want to see when Judgment was used on 2 or 3 targets or a single target, which you can tell from the timelines here, from the timestamps. So like an example here, that one at 33 seconds, that was a single target, but that's fine because there is Imperium power. So that was a free cast. We scroll through here at 53 seconds. There's no Imperium power. And he used Divine Storm on a single target, so that was a bad Divine Storm. That should have been a Templar's Verdict instead. See this one here at 56 seconds? That one hit 3 targets, so that was good. Here's one at 1 minute, 1 second. It only hit 2 targets. So that would be a bad cast. You don't want to do that when you're running Righteous Verdict. Again, I'm not going to go through them all, but that's the general idea. You'll know if it was Imperium power because you'll see it right here. He has Imperium power and it fades. So this was used for the 1 minute, 13 seconds. So that was fine. You want to look for the ones that happen and there's no Imperium power buff on them. Like here, he used a Divine Storm, hit 3 targets, that's fine. Here's one here. Only hit 2 targets, not ideal. So just small things there. And you can just use this to go over. But again, it's something you don't have to check for usually. As long as you know how to use it right after you start using it right, that's one less thing to track. We'll just go ahead and get out of that though. So one thing that we see that there was a large amount of downtime on the fight. We mentioned earlier there were those large gaps here. Now some of them are from running to ads, which took a little bit longer than to be expected. Some are just delays in the ability usage in general. And some are from waiting to attack the boss. But overall, even if we exclude these windows where he was not attacking the boss because he was probably waiting to be okay, there was still too much downtime. And aside from not pressing your buttons fast enough, the other cause of downtime is when you are spending Templar's Verdict or Divine Storm on 3 Holy Power. So again, mentioned earlier, we are a cooldown based class. We want to have our generators on cooldown before we spend. The exception to that is at the very start of Crusade, when you're trying to build your 10 stacks as fast as possible. But once you have those 10 stacks, or you're outside of Crusade, you want to build, and then you want to spend. Alright, we're almost done here. Just a couple more things to go over. One, I mentioned that he's using Righteous Verdict. WoW Analyzer gives us a nice little overview here. We can see it did 74,000 damage. The total damage benefit was 2.12%. That was the buffed cast percentage was 60.87. So this is very low. When you're using Righteous Verdict, at the very minimum, you want to have around 75% of your cast being buffed, and you want the overall damage contribution to be around 4% on single target. And on champions, it's mainly a single target fight. There isn't that much AoE, so even for champions, it would be around the same. Ideally, your Righteous Verdict usage will be over 80%. That's the goal. If you're above 80% buffed cast, you're doing good. And for Righteous Verdict, a common mistake is they'll try to keep the buff up, and you don't have to do that. You can ignore the buff. As long as you do your rotation properly, the buff will stay up by itself. It doesn't require any extra effort. You shouldn't modify your rotation to try to keep the buff going. Just by doing the rotation itself properly, that'll keep the buff up as much as you can. So in this case, he would have been much better off using Zeal. On average, Zeal will do around 3 to 3.5% of your overall damage. When you look at your meter, though, you'll see Zeal. You'll be like, why did Zeal only do 1.8? That's because there's two parts to Zeal. One part is the holy damage, which you see on your meter. The second part is the additional auto attacks, which you can't track those easily. You really don't know how many extra attacks you got from Zeal. But if you sim it, you can compare in the sim. And if you include those extra auto attacks, Zeal and the overall range is usually around 3 to 3.5%. So 3.5% on single target, and an AoE around 3%. So in an AoE fight, if you find that your damage for Righteous Verdict drops below 3%, you should use Zeal instead. Or if you have a hard time playing in general, Zeal will be friendlier for you. The second thing we're going to go over is Shield of Vengeance. In this case, there was 0% absorbed. He had that pre-cast shield, and it was not used a second time. So on champions, it's actually pretty easy to use your Shield of Vengeance to do damage. If we go back to my guide here, up top there's a section called Mythic Rating. And we're in Battle for Dazara Lore. We'll go there. Now, not all the bosses are filled out yet. All the talents are filled out, but notes aren't. But we can see here for Champion of the Light, Shield of Vengeance can be used on Retribution Wave, which happens while attacking the boss, or on Judgment Reckoning, or Divine Mallet. And Retribution Wave happens pretty frequently, so outside of your wings, if you're hitting the boss, you can feel free to press it, and it will probably explode, or if you're waiting for the boss to use Judgment Reckoning, that will also cause it to break. Or if the Crusader ads are throwing hammers at you, you could use those hammers to pop the shield. So on this fight, he could have used it twice, realistically. We go to abilities here. It'll say 1 out of 2. So in this case, he could have got 2. Sometimes it'll be cut kind of close. It might say 3, but you probably won't get 3 unless you can use it on cooldown. But you do want to aim to use it as much as possible, especially on a fight like Champions where it isn't a hard fight, so you can just use it to cheese damage. On some fights, you'll probably want to save it, like Mechatork. Mechatork is a high damage fight, so in that case, you might be better saving it as a defensive. But on easier fights, or fights that you have on farm, to do more damage, you might want to abuse it a bit to do more damage. And the last thing I wanted to mention here is you might have noticed that his Treacherous Covenant gave him 0 average strength. Now, this is not a WoW Analyzer bug. We can go to the log. We go to buffs. And we can see here, there's no Treacherous Covenant buff. It's not listed anywhere here. Now, this is a byproduct of the 5th Ring of Azerite traits. Sometimes what happens is the Azerite traits will bug out and they won't work. So if you're using Treacherous Covenant, it's pretty easy to tell. If you're missing your buff, then something is wrong. And there's a few ways to fix it. You can take the gear off or put it back on to see if that fixes it. You can log out, then log back in to see if that helps. Or sometimes, in extreme cases, you might have to actually reforge the piece to get the buff to be active. It is a very annoying bug. If you do encounter it, definitely make sure to submit a bug report in-game. And this can happen to any Azerite trait, not just Treacherous Covenant. But that was going over logs. It's a bit longer than our last video because there was a bit more to go over. Again, if you need any help, definitely check out my guide here. There's different sections to go to. If you want more live help, definitely go to the Hammer of Wrath Paladin Discord. There's the Ret FAQ channel, which has some frequently asked questions, which might answer what you have. There's also guides linked in there, like my guide. There's also other guides from like a Wowhead there as well, which you can check out. And if you still have questions, there's that Ret Questions channel where you can ask questions and try to get help. Or if you do have any other questions, you can always ask me in the comments if you like, and I'll do my best to answer them. But that's all I had for now. Thank you, and have a good day.